They paired me with an older woman and a singles mixer, but no one was ready for my reaction. I still remember the sound of people laughing when our names were called. Not because the joke was funny, because they thought I had become one. The woman standing across from me looked to be somewhere in her late 50s. She wore a navy blue dress, silver earrings, and had graceful streaks of gray in her dark hair. She smiled politely while the room filled with whispers. Oh, they ran out of women his age. Poor guy. Someone actually laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. The organizer looked embarrassed. Ethan, would you mind pairing with Margaret just for this activity? We'll rotate in 15 minutes. I glanced around the room. Every eye was on me, waiting for disappointment. Instead, I smiled. I'd be honored. The room went completely silent. Margaret blinked at me. Then, she smiled back. That single decision changed my life in ways none of us could have imagined. I was 32, recently divorced, and absolutely convinced dating had become a competition where everyone pretended not to care while secretly judging everything. The singles mixer had been my sister Lily's idea. You spend every weekend fixing your motorcycle or reading history books, she'd complained. Go meet people. I don't need a relationship. No, she'd replied, but you do need to remember that the world still has kind people in it. So there I was, wearing a shirt I had ironed twice, because I hadn't done this in years. The event was held inside a renovated art gallery, downtown. There were fairy lights across the ceiling, soft jazz in the background, and little tables covered with desserts nobody was actually eating. Everyone seemed busy trying to look casually attractive. Then, fate handed me Margaret. She extended her hand. I'm sorry about this. I frowned. Why are you apologizing? Because you're probably disappointed. I shook my head. I'm disappointed and everyone's staring at us. That made her laugh. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was real. For the first time that evening, the whispers faded into the background. The first activity involved asking random questions from cards. Margaret picked the first one. If you could relive one day of your life, which would it be? She looked out the window before answering. The day my husband proposed. You were married? For 33 years. Were? He passed away 4 years ago. There wasn't bitterness in her voice, only love. I still talk to him sometimes, she admitted. I nodded. I still talk to my father. She looked surprised. He passed when I was 19. I'm sorry. Me too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It felt peaceful. Then she asked my question. What made your marriage end? I expected judgment. Instead, I found understanding. We stopped listening, I admitted. No affair? No. No dramatic betrayal? No. What happened? We became roommates. Margaret slowly nodded. The quiet endings are usually the saddest. Nobody had ever described my divorce so perfectly. When the organizer announced it was time to rotate partners, something unexpected happened. I wasn't ready to leave. Neither was Margaret. She smiled. Thank you. For what? For treating me like a person. I honestly didn't know how to answer that, because I couldn't imagine treating her any other way. The organizer approached. Ready to switch? I looked at Margaret, then back at him. I smiled. I'd like to stay here. The room became quiet again. Across the hall I noticed a young blonde woman rolling her eyes. Another man whispered something to his friend before chuckling. The organizer hesitated. If you're both comfortable, Margaret laughed. I'm comfortable. So am I, he shrugged. Then stay. For the next hour, we ignored everyone else. We talked about travel, books, music, life. She had visited 17 countries with her husband before cancer stole him away. I had never even left North America. She loved classical music. I loved old rock bands. She hated coffee. I couldn't survive mornings without it. Yet conversation flowed effortlessly. At one point she leaned closer. Can I tell you something? Of course. I know. I almost walked out. Why? Because I didn't want to be someone's pity assignment. My chest tightened. I'm glad you stayed. So am I. Near the end of the evening, everyone gathered for refreshments. As Margaret walked toward the drink table, I heard someone behind me. Dude. I turned. A man around my age smirked. You know this is a dating event, right? It is. So why are you hanging around someone's mom? Several people nearby laughed. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted. Maybe because she's the most interesting woman here. It was Margaret. She had heard everything. The man shrugged. I was joking. No, she said gently. You were judging. He looked embarrassed. I stepped beside her. You know what's funny? What? I've spent the last 2 hours having one of the best conversations I've had in years. I looked around the room. Most people here have been trying to impress each other. I smiled toward Margaret. We've just been honest. Nobody laughed this time. The man quietly walked away. When the mixer ended, we stood outside beneath cool autumn air. I suppose this is goodbye. I surprised myself. Would you like dinner sometime? She blinked, then smiled kindly. As friends? I nodded. As friends. I'd love that. We exchanged numbers. As I drove home, I realized something. For the first time since my divorce, I wasn't thinking about loneliness. I was thinking about connection. Over the next few months, Margaret became one of my closest friends. Every Thursday we had dinner. Sometimes we argued about books. Sometimes we spent hours laughing over stories from our lives. She told me embarrassing stories about raising 2 sons. I told her about the ridiculous mistakes I'd made during college. People often assumed she was my mother. Sometimes they assumed she was my aunt. We stopped correcting strangers. It simply wasn't important. One snowy evening, she invited me to her house. I want you to meet someone. Her living room was filled with old photographs. There were pictures of hiking trips, birthdays, beach vacations, anniversaries. Then she handed me a worn leather album. My husband kept journals. I carefully opened one. Inside were handwritten notes spanning decades. Tiny observations. Gratitude. Love letters disguised as diary entries. One page read, "The secret isn't finding the perfect person. It's choosing the same imperfect person every morning." I stared at the words. Margaret smiled softly. He would have liked you. I wish I could have met him. So do I. She looked toward his photograph. I think he'd be happy I'm laughing again. Months passed. Life became brighter. Not because romance had suddenly appeared. Because friendship had. Then one afternoon Margaret called. Her voice trembled. What's wrong? It's Daniel, her oldest son. He had an accident. I drove to the hospital immediately. Daniel survived. Broken ribs, a fractured leg, concussion, nothing life-threatening. While Margaret sat beside his bed, exhausted, I handled phone calls, brought food, and helped however I could. Late that night, Daniel looked at me. You've done more for Mom than some relatives. I shrugged. She'd do the same for me. He smiled weakly. I think she already has. He was right. She had helped me trust people again. Weeks later, Daniel recovered enough to return home. Before I left, Margaret hugged me. A real hug. The kind that says things words cannot. I'm proud of you, she whispered. For what? For choosing kindness when everyone expected embarrassment. I didn't realize until then how much that night had meant to her. Nearly a year after the mixer, Lily invited me to her birthday party. Margaret came too. Halfway through the evening, Lily pulled me aside. Can I tell you something? Sure. I almost didn't force you to attend that mixer. I'm glad you did. So am I. She pointed across the room. A woman was laughing with Margaret over slices of chocolate cake. Her name's Claire. She was around my age, warm-eyed, and completely uninterested in pretending to be someone else. Apparently, Margaret had met her through a local volunteer group. Later that evening, Margaret waved us together. "Ethan, Claire loves history." Claire smiled. "And motorcycles." I laughed. "Oddly specific." Margaret grinned. "I may have mentioned you once or twice." Claire rolled her eyes playfully. "More like every Thursday." The three of us laughed. A year earlier, I would have believed the night was another setup. Instead, it felt natural, comfortable. Claire and I talked for hours. No games, no pretending, just honesty. As the party ended, she asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime. I looked toward Margaret. She winked. "I think your ride home is waiting." Claire laughed. "I'll pretend I didn't hear that." We started dating. Slowly. Carefully. 6 months later, I introduced Claire to the bench in the city park, where Margaret and I often sat talking about life. Margaret watched us with quiet happiness. "You two fit." Claire squeezed my hand. "I think so too." I looked at Margaret. "You know, what? If they hadn't paired us together." She smiled before I finished. "I know." Years later, when Claire and I stood in front of family and friends, exchanging wedding vows, Margaret sat in the front row. Not in the section reserved for guests, in the one reserved for family. When people asked who she was, I always answered the same way. The reason I'm standing here. Because she was. Everyone at that singles mixer believed happiness only looked one way. They believed age decided worth. They believed romance was the only successful ending. They were wrong. The greatest relationship I found that night wasn't a love story. It was a friendship that healed two broken hearts, one grieving the loss of a husband, one grieving the loss of hope. Sometimes life doesn't give you the person you expect. Sometimes it gives you the person you need first. And if you're wise enough not to turn away because of appearances, that unexpected meeting may quietly lead you to everything you've been searching for all along.